Second condition is that people should experience a lack of meaning making, and that the one follows from the other. When people feel socially isolated, they spontaneously will start to feel that their life doesn't make meaning anymore, that it doesn't make sense anymore, just because people are social beings. And if they drop away from the social bond, they have the feeling that they do not know anymore why they live for or what they live for. And that makes them feel, confronts them with a lack of meaning making. And then the third condition is that there should be a lot of free-floating anxiety, free-floating frustration, and free-floating aggression. This third condition is also extremely important. So the negative effects, such as anxiety, frustration, and aggression, should be freely floating. And by that I mean that people experience anxiety, frustration, and aggression without knowing what they feel anxious for, what they feel frustrated for, and what they feel aggressive for. And also that condition follows logically from the first condition, the social isolation. That's a little bit hard to explain, but it's explained in the book. Why people who feel socially isolated, they will be confronted with a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression that they cannot connect to a mental representation. And that's an extremely aversive mental state. If people feel anxious without knowing what they feel anxious for, they feel out of control, radically out of control, and the anxiety threatens to turn into panic, which is maybe the most aversive mental state. So if a population is in this mental state, and these conditions were really met before the corona crisis, that was extremely clear. There never had been as many people who felt socially isolated. There never had been as many people who were experiencing a lack of meaning making. For instance, 60% of the people at least considered their job to be a so-called bullshit job. That means a job of which they didn't understand at all what it was good for. And then the number of anxiety disorders and so on, and frustration and aggression was extremely high. So before every large-scale process of mass formation, these conditions are met. They were met in the Soviet Union in the beginning of the 20th century. They were met in before the rise of Nazi Germany, and they were met before the corona crisis. And when a population is in this state, something very typically might happen. If under these conditions, a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, then something typically happens. All this free-floating anxiety, all this anxiety in the population, which was not connected to a mental representation, connects to the object of anxiety, for instance, a virus, or it could be the Jews in Nazi Germany, or the aristocracy in the Soviet Union. All this free-floating anxiety connects to this object of anxiety, and there might be a huge willingness in the population to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. So people all together start to fight, or a large part of the population all together starts a heroic battle with the object of anxiety. And in this way, they also channel all their frustration and aggression in the direction of the object of anxiety on the one hand, but also on everyone who doesn't want to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. In this case, for instance, people who refuse the vaccine. That's only one example. And then, in a second step, so that's the first psychological advantage. All the anxiety that was freely floating in society is now connected to a mental representation. And then, in a second step, something even more important happens. Because many people participate in this war, the struggle with the object of anxiety together, a new social bond emerges. A new social bond emerges, which makes people feel connected again. And this new social bond is the real reason why people continue to buy into the narrative. Why could people continue to believe in the narrative? This new solidarity, this new citizenship frees the people. It liberates them from the social isolation they felt in. And they were very often not aware of. So in this way, you see that in general, the reason why people go along with the narrative is because it leads to the new social bond, because it allows them to channel all their frustration and aggression, and because it connects their anxiety to an object. And as soon as you realize that, you realize that no matter how sound the rational arguments against the narrative are, they will not have an impact. Simply because people do not buy into the narrative because it is right or correct from a scientific point of view, for instance. They buy into the narrative because of the psychological advantages that I was referring to. In the first place, the new social bond that emerges. And in one way or another, you could say that even the more absurd the narrative becomes, the better it will function and the more it will be applauded by a certain part of the population who is really into the process of mass formation, simply because the narrative and the measures, for instance, the corona measures associated to the narrative, function as rituals. And a ritual is a symbolic behavior which is always absurd or meaningless from a pragmatic point of view, and which always asks a sacrifice of the individual through which the individual shows that the collective is more important than the individual. And again, as soon as you start to understand that, you start to understand why people become radically blind, or why people are not impressed by rational counter-argumentations, and why people continue to buy into the narrative, even if it is utterly absurd.